Our new landlord pulled blueprints from the attic. They marked 7 apartments with X's. We'd just moved into apartment 8. Our new landlord pulled blueprints from the attic. They marked 7 apartments with X's. We'd just moved into apartment 8. My girlfriend Zoe found him in the hallway outside our door at 11 on a Saturday morning. Blueprints spread across the worn carpet, a red marker in his hand. She called me from the bedroom where I was unpacking boxes. When I came out, Gerald Finch was standing there holding the aged paper, like it was evidence in a trial. He was maybe 65, thin and tall with white hair and glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He'd bought the building 3 weeks ago after the previous owner died suddenly. We'd met him once during the closing, signed new lease paperwork, paid our deposit. He'd seemed normal then, pleasant even, talking about updating the units and improving the property. Now he stood in our hallway staring at blueprints that had 7 apartments marked with large red X's drawn so hard the marker had torn through the paper in places. Our apartment, 8C, sat unmarked at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway. Gerald looked up at us with an expression I couldn't read. Fear maybe, or recognition, or something worse. He asked if we'd noticed anything unusual about the building. Strange sounds, odd smells, feelings of being watched. Zoe laughed nervously and said no. We'd only been here 3 days. Gerald didn't laugh. He rolled up the blueprints carefully and said he needed to show us something. He needed us to understand what we'd moved into. We followed Gerald down to the basement because he insisted, and because something in his voice made it impossible to refuse. The building had 16 units total, 4 per floor across 4 floors. Gerald had bought it as an investment property, planning to renovate and flip it for profit. He'd spent the last 2 weeks going through the previous owner's records and belongings stored in the attic. That's when he found the blueprints along with files on every tenant who'd lived here over the past 30 years. The 7 apartments marked with X's corresponded to 7 units where tenants had died under what Gerald called questionable circumstances. He spread the blueprints on a workbench in the dim basement and pointed to each X in turn. Apartment 2A, 2015, tenant named Michael Vega found dead in his bathtub, ruled accidental drowning despite being only 32 and in perfect health. Apartment 3B, 2016, tenant named Lisa Huang died of carbon monoxide poisoning, even though the building had working detectors. Apartment 1D, 2017, tenant named Robert Gaines fell down the stairs and broke his neck. Apartment 4A, 2018, tenant named Angela Pierce died in her sleep from what the coroner called sudden cardiac arrest. She was 28. Apartment 2C, 2019, tenant named Derek Foster shot himself in the head. His suicide note was incoherent, rambling about. Voices in the walls. Apartment 3D, 2020, tenant named Yuki Sato died from what appeared to be self-inflicted stab wounds. Apartment 1B, 2021, tenant named James Knox overdosed on pills he didn't have a prescription for. Gerald pulled out files for each deceased tenant, and I saw they all had the same notation written in the margin in the previous owner's handwriting. 7 deaths across 7 years, 1 per year, different apartments each time, but always in this building. The previous owner, a man named Harold Voss, had documented everything meticulously. He'd kept newspaper clippings, police reports, coroner findings, everything. Gerald showed us Harold's notes, pages and pages of observations about the building's history going back decades before he'd owned it. Harold had discovered that the pattern extended back to when the building was first constructed in 1985. At least 1 tenant died every year under unusual circumstances, sometimes more than 1. The building had a body count of over 40 deaths in 38 years. That number was impossible to ignore or explain away as coincidence. Gerald said Harold had spent years trying to understand why. Had the building been constructed on cursed land? Was there environmental contamination causing health problems? Was someone killing tenants systematically? Harold's notes showed he'd investigated every angle and found nothing conclusive. Just a building where people died at a rate far exceeding statistical norms. The really disturbing part was that Harold himself had died 3 weeks ago. Fell off a ladder while cleaning gutters. The police ruled it an accident. Gerald found Harold's body. He was the one who called 911. He'd been in the process of buying the building from Harold when it happened. The sale went through Harold's estate. I asked Gerald why he was showing us this. Why not just keep it to himself, finish the renovations, sell the building and move on? Gerald's hands were shaking when he pointed to the blueprints again. Because Harold had written something else in his notes. Something that made Gerald's blood run cold. In the last entry, dated 2 days before Harold died, he'd written that he'd figured out the pattern. He knew why tenants were dying. He knew who was responsible. But he didn't write down what he'd discovered. Just that he planned to handle it himself and then leave the building forever. Gerald believed Harold's death wasn't an accident. Believed someone or something had killed him to keep him quiet. And now Gerald was the owner, going through the same records, discovering the same information. He was terrified he'd be next. He wanted us to know because apartment 8C had never been marked with an X. In all the years of deaths, no one in 8C had ever died. Harold's notes specifically mentioned this. 8C was the only unit in the building with a clean record. Gerald thought that meant something. Maybe it was safe. Maybe we'd be protected there. Or maybe, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe 8C was next. Zoe grabbed my hand so hard her nails dug into my palm. She asked Gerald if he'd called the police. He said yes, he'd tried. Showed them Harold's files and the death records. They'd been polite but dismissive. Said the deaths were all investigated at the time and closed as accidents or suicides or natural causes. There was no evidence of foul play. The detective he'd spoken to suggested Gerald was experiencing stress from the building purchase and Harold's death. Suggested he see a therapist. Gerald said he'd also tried contacting family members of the deceased tenants. Most didn't want to talk about it. A few said they'd always suspected something was wrong, but could never prove anything. Michael Vega's sister told Gerald that Michael had called her the night before he died, saying he'd discovered something disturbing about the building. He was going to move out. She never heard from him again. Derek Foster's mother said Derek had been hearing voices for weeks before his death, becoming increasingly paranoid, insisting someone was watching him through the walls. Robert Gaines's brother said Robert had been planning to break his lease early because he felt unsafe. 2 days later, he fell down the stairs. The pattern was there. Tenants who got too curious or tried to leave ended up dead. I told Gerald we were leaving, packing our stuff and breaking the lease that day. We'd only been here 3 days. Most of our belongings were still in boxes. We could be out by tonight. Gerald shook his head and said it wasn't that simple. He pulled out our lease agreement and showed us the clause we'd signed. Early termination required 60 days' notice and forfeiture of our security deposit plus 2 months' rent as penalty. We'd paid first month, last month, and security when we signed. That was $6,000 total. We were graduate students living on loans and part-time work. We couldn't afford to lose that money. We couldn't afford to pay the penalty. We were trapped. Gerald saw the devastation on our faces, and his expression softened. He said he wasn't trying to keep us here against our will. He'd waive the penalties and let us out of the lease if we wanted to go, but he had a different proposal. He'd give us 2 months free rent if we stayed and helped him investigate, helped him figure out what Harold had discovered. Between the 3 of us, maybe we could solve this before anyone else got hurt. He'd install security cameras, new locks, give us keys to every unit. He'd be transparent about everything he found. We'd be partners in this. Zoe said, absolutely not. We were leaving today. I agreed with her, but then Gerald mentioned something else, something that changed everything. He said apartment 8C's previous tenant, a woman named Ruth Montgomery, had lived here for 15 years before moving out last month. 15 years in the only apartment where no one had ever died. Ruth was still alive, still local, and Gerald had her phone number. She'd agreed to meet with him tomorrow. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she'd stayed alive because she'd figured out how to navigate whatever was wrong with this building. Gerald said we could talk to Ruth, hear what she had to say, and then decide. One conversation. If after talking to Ruth we still wanted to leave, he'd let us go with no penalty. Zoe looked at me, and I could see her doing the math. We'd spent 3 months looking for an apartment we could afford near campus. The rental market was brutal. If we left now, we'd be scrambling to find something else. Probably paying more, definitely going deeper into debt. And there was something else too. A part of me that wanted to know, wanted to understand what was happening here. Maybe it was stupid, maybe it was dangerous. But I nodded and told Gerald we'd stay until we talked to Ruth. Ruth Montgomery agreed to meet us Sunday afternoon at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building. She was in her 70s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in a cardigan and jeans. She sat down across from Gerald, Zoe, and me with a cup of tea and studied us for a long moment before speaking. She said she'd been wondering when someone would come asking questions. She'd lived in 8C from 2007 to last month, watching tenant after tenant die in other units, always wondering if she'd be next. She'd survived by following rules that she'd figured out over years of careful observation, rules that had kept her alive while others died around her. The first rule was simple: never go into the basement alone. The basement was where it started, where the presence or entity or whatever you wanted to call it was strongest. Ruth had seen things down there over the years, shadows that moved wrong, sounds that didn't match any mechanical system, a feeling of being watched that was so intense it made her physically sick. She'd learned to avoid the basement entirely unless absolutely necessary, and never, ever at night. Rule 2 was never investigate strange sounds in the middle of the night. Ruth said she'd heard things over the years: footsteps in empty apartments, voices through walls, scratching sounds from inside vents. Other tenants would investigate these sounds. They'd go into the hallway with flashlights, knock on neighbors' doors, try to figure out where the noise was coming from. Those tenants tended to die within weeks. Ruth learned to put in earplugs, turn on white noise, and ignore whatever she heard after dark. Rule 3 was never accept the landlord's invitation to move to a different unit. Harold Voss had a habit of offering tenants free upgrades or unit swaps, especially if they'd been in one apartment for a long time. Ruth had been offered moves to 2A, 3B, and 4A at various points, all 3 apartments that later had deaths. She always declined, always stayed in 8C. She believed 8C was protected somehow, insulated from whatever haunted the rest of the building. Rule 4 was never discuss the deaths with other tenants. Ruth said there was something about acknowledging the pattern out loud that drew attention, made you a target. She'd watched tenants form groups to investigate, share theories, plan confrontations with Harold. Those tenants died. Ruth kept her mouth shut and her head down. Rule 5 was the most important and the hardest to follow. Never try to help other tenants. Ruth's voice cracked when she explained this one. She'd seen people in trouble over the years, new tenants who were experiencing the same things she'd experienced, who were scared and confused and reaching out for help. Ruth had wanted to warn them, wanted to share what she knew, but every time she'd tried, something bad happened, either to her or to them. She'd learned through painful experience that survival meant isolation, meant watching people die and doing nothing to stop it. The guilt had eaten at her for 15 years. That's why she finally moved out last month. Not because she was in danger, but because she couldn't stand being a witness to more deaths. Couldn't stand following rules that required her to value her own life over everyone else's. She'd rather leave than become complicit anymore. Gerald asked what Ruth thought was causing the deaths. She said she didn't know for certain, but she had theories. The building had been constructed on the site of an old psychiatric hospital that burned down in 1982. 30 patients and 5 staff members had died in that fire. The hospital had been notorious for abusive practices before it burned. Experimental treatments, patient abuse, suspicious deaths that were covered up. Ruth believed something from that hospital remained, something angry and vengeful that fed on the fear and suffering of people who lived here now. Zoe asked why Apartment 8C was safe. Ruth said she'd researched the blueprints and the original hospital layout. Apartment 8C sat on the exact location of what had been the hospital's chapel, the only part of the facility that had been used for comfort rather than torment. Whatever haunted this building couldn't enter that space. It was consecrated ground in some sense, protected. But that protection only extended to the apartment itself. The hallways, the basement, the other units, all of it was vulnerable. Ruth said as long as we stayed inside 8C at night and followed the rules, we'd probably survive. But she warned us not to get curious, not to investigate, not to try to help anyone else. That's what got people killed. Their compassion or their courage or their desire to understand. This building punished those qualities, rewarded cowardice and selfishness instead. That's why Ruth had survived 15 years, because she'd been willing to be a coward. Gerald asked if Harold had figured something else out, something beyond Ruth's rules. She said yes, she believed he had. Harold had mentioned to her a few weeks before he died that he'd found old hospital records in the city, archives, records that named names, staff members who'd been particularly cruel, patients who'd died under suspicious circumstances, administrators who'd covered up abuse. Harold told Ruth he was going to expose what happened in that hospital, make sure everyone knew the truth. He died 3 days later. I asked Ruth if she'd be willing to go to the archives with us, help us find what Harold had found. She shook her head firmly and said absolutely not. She'd given us the information we needed to stay safe. What we did with it was our choice, but she wasn't getting involved anymore. She'd paid her dues. She stood up to leave and then paused. She told us one more thing, something she'd never told anyone. 2 years ago, she'd woken up in the middle of the night to find her apartment door standing open. She always locked it, always checked twice before bed, but it was open and she could hear something in the hallway, breathing, heavy and wet and wrong. Ruth had sat frozen in her bed watching the open doorway, certain something was about to come in. Instead, she heard a voice, not speaking to her, but speaking about her, talking to someone else she couldn't see. The voice said she was protected but wouldn't be forever, said eventually the protection would wear thin and then she'd be available. Ruth had stayed awake until dawn. When the sun came up, her door was closed and locked again, like it had never been open at all. She moved out 2 months later. She looked at each of us and said if we were smart, we'd do the same. Then she left. We sat in the coffee shop for another hour debating what to do. Gerald believed Ruth's story, believed the building was genuinely haunted or cursed or whatever you wanted to call it. He wanted to go to the archives, find Harold's research, expose the truth about the psychiatric hospital. He thought if the history was brought to light, acknowledged publicly, maybe the haunting would stop. Maybe the victims would find peace. Zoe thought Gerald was delusional, said there was probably a rational explanation for the deaths. Gas leaks, or toxic mold, or some kind of environmental contamination that caused health problems and hallucinations. She wanted to hire an environmental testing company, inspect the building properly, find the real cause. I was somewhere in between. I didn't know if I believed in ghosts, but I believed something was wrong. Whether it was supernatural or environmental or even a human predator hiding in the building, people were dying, and we needed to figure out why. We agreed to split up tasks. Gerald would go to the city archives and look for Harold's research. Zoe would contact environmental testing companies and see what kind of inspections we could afford. I would go through Harold's files more carefully, look for patterns or clues we'd missed. We'd regroup in 3 days and share what we found. I spent Monday and Wednesday going through every file in Gerald's office. Harold had been meticulous in, his documentation. Each death had a folder containing police reports, medical examiner findings, newspaper articles, personal notes. I made a timeline, mapped out where each death occurred, looked for connections between victims. What I found disturbed me more than anything Ruth had said. The deaths weren't random. They followed a pattern based on apartment location. The building had 4 floors with 4 apartments each, arranged in a square around a central stairwell. Deaths moved in a spiral pattern, floor by floor, apartment by apartment, always clockwise around the building. Starting from 1A in 2014, moving to 1B in 2015, then 1C, 1D, then up to 2A, 2B, and so on. The pattern had been working its way around the building systematically for years. By that logic, 8C should have been hit in 2021. But Yuki Sato had died in 3D instead, breaking the pattern. Then James Knox died in 1B in 2021, which also didn't fit. The spiral had stuttered, 2 years off pattern. I didn't know what that meant, but it felt significant. Like something had disrupted the mechanism. Maybe Ruth living in 8C for so long had thrown off the timing, or maybe something else had changed. Gerald called Wednesday evening. He'd spent 2 days at the city archives and found what Harold had discovered. The psychiatric hospital that previously occupied this site was called Riverside State Hospital. It operated from 1947 to 1982 under the direction of a doctor named Edward Calloway. Dr. Calloway had been a pioneer in experimental psychiatric treatments, electroshock therapy, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies. He'd performed hundreds of procedures on patients who were committed involuntarily. Many of them died. Many more were left permanently damaged. Gerald found records showing that 37 patients died at Riverside between 1975 and 1982. Official causes of death ranged from heart attacks to suicide to complications from treatment. But several staff members had filed complaints over the years claiming Dr. Calloway was killing patients deliberately, conducting lethal experiments under the guise of therapy. The complaints were investigated and dismissed. Dr. Calloway had connections to influential families and politicians. He was protected. The hospital burned in October 1982. The fire started in the middle of the night in the wing where the most dangerous patients were housed. 30 patients died, trapped in locked rooms. 5 staff members died trying to evacuate them. Dr. Calloway survived. He was investigated for arson, but never charged. The hospital closed permanently. The land sat empty for 3 years before being sold to developers who built the apartment building in 1985. Gerald had found one more thing. A list of patients who died at Riverside between 1975 and 1982. 37 names. He read them to me over the phone and I wrote them down. When he finished, I counted. 37 deaths at the hospital over 7 years. 37 deaths in the apartment building over 37 years since it opened. The numbers matched exactly. 1 death per hospital victim, like something was balancing scales. Gerald said he'd also found Dr. Calloway's address. The doctor was still alive, 93 years old, living in a nursing home across town. Gerald had called and made an appointment to visit him tomorrow. He wanted me to come with him, wanted someone else present as a witness to whatever Calloway said. I agreed, even though the idea of meeting the man who might be responsible for all of this made my stomach turn. Zoe had her own update. She'd hired an environmental company to inspect the building. They'd tested for carbon monoxide, radon, mold, lead paint, asbestos, everything. Results came back clean. The building had normal levels of everything. No contamination, no gas leaks, no environmental explanation for the deaths, which meant we were back to supernatural causes, or something worse. Dr. Edward Calloway lived in a memory care facility on the north side of town. Gerald and I visited Thursday afternoon. We were led to a common area where Calloway sat in a wheelchair by a window, staring out at the parking lot. He was ancient and frail, his skin paper-thin, his eyes cloudy with cataracts. A nurse told us he had good days and bad days. Today was a good day. He was lucid and communicative. She left us alone with him. Gerald introduced himself as the new owner of the building constructed on the Riverside Hospital site. Calloway's cloudy eyes focused on Gerald's face. He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. He'd been wondering when someone would come. He'd been waiting for years. Gerald asked what he meant. Calloway said he knew about the deaths at the apartment building. He'd kept track, read obituaries, monitored news reports. 37 deaths so far. He seemed pleased about this. Proud even. I asked him directly if he was responsible. He laughed, a wet rattling sound. He said in a sense, yes. He'd built something at Riverside that couldn't be destroyed. Something that lived beyond fire and demolition and time. Calloway explained that his work at Riverside had been misunderstood. He wasn't torturing patients. He was unlocking potential, opening doors in the human mind that most people kept closed. He'd been trying to access what he called the threshold space, the boundary between life and death, consciousness and unconsciousness. He believed that in that space existed pure power, the ability to reshape reality. He'd used his patients as test subjects, pushing them to the edge of death and pulling them back over and over, trying to stabilize their presence in the threshold. Most of them died, but their deaths weren't failures. They were sacrifices, building blocks for what he was creating. By the time the hospital burned, Calloway had succeeded. He'd created a stable threshold space in the hospital chapel, a doorway that remained open even after the building was gone. The apartment building had been constructed directly over that doorway. Everyone who lived there was living on top of a wound in reality, A place where the barrier between life and death was so thin it barely existed. The patients who died at Riverside were trapped in that threshold space. Angry, suffering, hungry. They pulled tenants through the doorway, one per year, collecting the living to join them in their torment. Gerald asked why apartment 8C was protected. Calloway said the chapel had been consecrated before he corrupted it. The blessing lingered, weakened, but still present. Whoever lived in 8C was insulated from the threshold as long as they stayed inside and followed certain rules. But eventually, the protection would erode. Eventually, 8C would fall like all the others. It was inevitable. I asked Calloway how to stop it, how to close the doorway and end the deaths. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, there was only one way. Someone had to go through the doorway willingly, descend into the threshold space and seal it from the inside. It required a sacrifice, a life given freely to close what he'd opened. But whoever did that would be trapped in the threshold forever with the hospital victims, suffering eternally. No one would be that selfless. No one would choose that fate, so the deaths would continue, forever. Gerald asked if Calloway felt any remorse, any guilt for what he'd done. Calloway's smile widened. He said guilt was for weak minds. He'd achieved something extraordinary. He'd proven that death was permeable, that consciousness persisted beyond the body, that humans could touch the divine if they were willing to suffer for it. The 37 patients who died were immortal now, part of something larger. He'd given them transcendence. I wanted to hit him, wanted to hurt this ancient monster who'd caused so much pain and felt nothing but pride. Gerald put a hand on my arm, held me back. He asked Calloway one more question. He asked if Harold Voss had visited him before he died. Calloway's expression shifted, became cautious. He said yes, Harold had come 3 weeks before his death, had asked the same questions we were asking. Harold had left angry, promising to expose everything, promising to bring Calloway to justice. Calloway had known Harold would fail. The threshold protected its creator. Anyone who tried to reveal the truth would be silenced. Harold's fall from the ladder hadn't been an accident. The threshold had eliminated a threat. The same thing would happen to us if we weren't careful. Calloway suggested we forget what we'd learned, move away, let the building continue its work. Fighting it only led to death. We left without another word. In the parking lot, Gerald sat in his car with his head in his hands. He said he didn't know what to do, couldn't live with himself if more people died, but couldn't sacrifice himself either, couldn't choose eternal suffering to save strangers. He was just an old man who'd bought a property. He wasn't a hero. I told him I understood. I wasn't a hero either, but we had to do something. We drove back to the building and I noticed something immediately. Police cars outside, 3 of them, lights flashing. Gerald parked and we ran to the entrance where officers were blocking access. I asked what happened. One officer said there'd been a death. Tenant in apartment 4B, young woman named Keisha Phillips. She'd been found in her bathtub an hour ago, apparent drowning. My heart stopped. The pattern had continued. I pushed past the officer and ran upstairs to 8C. Zoe was inside, alive and terrified. She'd heard screaming from 4B around noon, had almost gone to help but remembered Ruth's rules, stayed inside our apartment instead. She felt sick about it, guilty. If she'd gone to help, maybe Keisha would still be alive. I told her if she'd gone to help, she might be dead too. We stood in our apartment while police processed the scene down the hall. By evening, they'd removed Keisha's body and cleared out. The building was quiet, too quiet. Gerald knocked on our door around 8. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. He said he'd been thinking about Calloway's solution, about someone needing to sacrifice themselves to close the doorway. He said he was old, had already lived a full life. Maybe it should be him. He could do this, could end the deaths. I told him we didn't know if Calloway was telling the truth. Maybe there was another way to close the doorway that didn't require sacrifice. Maybe we could find it if we kept looking. Gerald shook his head. He said he'd watched a girl die today because he hadn't acted, hadn't closed the building, hadn't found a solution fast enough. He couldn't let that happen again. He was going to do it tonight, going down to the basement and finding the doorway and going through. I tried to stop him, tried to argue, but Gerald was determined. He said he'd already written a letter explaining everything, had sent copies to police, to the media, to city officials, had included Harold's research and Calloway's confession recorded on his phone during our visit. He'd documented everything so that even if he died, the truth would come out. The building would be condemned, the doorway would be known. Maybe that would help somehow. He asked me to take care of the building after he was gone, finish the renovations, make sure no more tenants moved in. I told him I would. He hugged me, then left. Zoe and I stayed in 8C listening. Around midnight, we heard a sound from below, a deep vibration that shook the walls, then silence. Gerald was gone. The next morning, I went down to the basement, found Gerald's body at the bottom of the stairs, neck broken. It looked like he'd fallen, just like Harold, just like Robert Gaines before him. The threshold had killed him before he could sacrifice himself, or maybe his death was the sacrifice. Maybe just trying had been enough. Police came again, ruled it an accidental fall. Gerald's letter had been sent, but officials dismissed it as the rambling of a mentally ill man. The building wasn't condemned. Nothing changed. Except Gerald's will left the building to me. I inherited it. Inherited the responsibility. Inherited the choice he'd tried to make. Zoe wanted to leave immediately. Said we'd done enough. Tried enough. This wasn't our problem. But I couldn't leave. Couldn't let more people die. I told her I'd found another option. Something Ruth had mentioned. The chapel had been consecrated. The protection in 8C came from that blessing. If I could get a priest to reconsecrate the entire building, maybe it would strengthen the barrier. Maybe it would close the doorway without requiring sacrifice. Zoe said I was grasping at straws, but she agreed to try. I contacted every church in the area. Most thought I was crazy. A few agreed to visit but refused to perform any blessing after seeing the building. Said they felt something wrong there. Wanted nothing to do with it. Finally, I found Father Gabriel Okafor, a priest who specialized in what he called spiritual warfare, exorcisms, cleansings, confronting demonic presences. He visited the building on a Saturday and spent an hour walking through every unit, every hallway, the basement. When he emerged, he was pale but resolute. He said I was right. The building sat on corrupt ground, but reconsecration alone wouldn't work. The doorway was too strong, too deliberately opened. It required deliberate closing. He said he'd perform a ritual, seal the threshold using prayer and holy rites, but he needed someone to stand at the center point, the exact location of the original doorway. The ritual would draw the threshold's attention. Whoever stood at the center would be attacked, possibly killed. They'd need faith and courage to survive. He looked at me when he said it. I realized he meant me. Father Okafor explained the ritual would take 3 hours. He'd perform it at midnight when the threshold was most active. I'd need to stand in the basement at the spot he'd identified. He'd surround me with blessed salt and holy water, would pray continuously for my protection, but ultimately, my survival depended on my will, my refusal to be pulled through. If I could hold on for 3 hours while he sealed the doorway, the threshold would close. The deaths would stop. If I failed, I'd be pulled through, and the ritual would fail. There was no backup plan, no safety net, just me and my will and Father Okafor's prayers. Zoe begged me not to do it, said we could just walk away, let someone else deal with this. But I couldn't. Keisha Phillips had died because I hadn't acted fast enough. Gerald had died trying to fix this. Harold had died uncovering the truth. I wasn't going to let their deaths be meaningless. I told Father Okafor I'd do it. We set the ritual for Sunday night. I spent the day preparing, writing letters to my family, calling my parents to tell them I loved them without explaining why, holding Zoe and trying to memorize the feeling of her in my arms. By 11, I was ready. Father Okafor arrived with his supplies, holy water, blessed salt, crucifixes, candles, religious texts in Latin. We went to the basement together. He identified the center point, a spot in the middle of the concrete floor directly below where 8C sat above. He told me to stand there, drew a circle of salt around me, placed candles at cardinal points, hung crucifixes on the walls. Then he began to pray. At first, nothing happened. Father Okafor chanted in Latin, his voice steady and strong. I stood in the circle watching shadows flicker in candlelight. Minutes passed. Then I felt it. A pull. Not physical. Something deeper. Like invisible hands reaching into my chest and pulling at my ribs, trying to yank something essential out of me. I gasped, and Father Okafor's voice got louder. The pull intensified. I could see things in the shadows now. Faces. Figures. The patients from Riverside. 37 of them. Surrounding me. Reaching for me. Their mouths open in silent screams. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in white clouds. The figures got closer. I could see details now. Hospital gowns. Restraints. Burn marks. They died in the fire. Died trapped and terrified. Now they were trapped forever in the threshold. The pull became agony. I fell to my knees. Father Okafor was shouting prayers. I could barely hear him over the roaring in my ears. The figures were inside the circle now, touching me. Their hands were cold and wrong. Not solid, but not air either. Something in between. They pulled harder. I felt myself slipping. Felt the edges of reality starting to blur. I was going to fall through, going to be pulled into the threshold. I thought about Gerald, about Harold, about Ruth surviving by being selfish, by not helping. Maybe that was the only way to survive this building. Maybe compassion was fatal here. Maybe I was a fool for trying. Then I thought about Keisha Phillips, about her screams that Zoe had heard and ignored, about dying alone and terrified in a bathtub while neighbors stayed safe behind locked doors. I thought about 37 patients who'd been tortured by Dr. Calloway, who'd died suffering, who'd been trapped in agony for decades. Someone had to help them. Someone had to care. I opened my eyes and looked at the figures surrounding me. I spoke to them. I said I was sorry for what had been done to them. Sorry they'd suffered. Sorry they'd been trapped. I said I wasn't their enemy. Wasn't like Calloway. I was trying to free them, trying to close the doorway so they could rest. I asked them to help me, to stop pulling, to let Father Okafor complete the ritual. The figures stopped moving, stopped pulling. They stared at me with hollow eyes. Then one of them, a woman maybe in her 30s, reached out and touched my face. Her hand was still cold but gentle now. She opened her mouth and sound came out. Not words, more like wind. But I understood somehow. She was tired. They were all tired. They'd been angry for so long, hurting others because they'd been hurt, but they wanted peace, wanted release. They'd just been trapped by Calloway's ritual, bound to the threshold, unable to leave. If I could break the binding, they'd help me close the doorway. They'd go willingly. I asked how to break it. The woman pointed upward, to 8C, to the chapel space. The consecration there was the key. If I could bring that blessing down here, combine it with Father Okafor's ritual, it would break Calloway's binding, free the patients, close the threshold. I told Father Okafor what I'd learned. He nodded and said he'd need something from 8C, something blessed or holy or meaningful, something that carried the protection. I thought about our apartment, what we had there. Then I remembered. Ruth had left something behind, a small wooden cross mounted on the wall. She'd told us it had been there since the building opened, since before she moved in. It was part of the original chapel consecration. I ran upstairs, my legs shaking, grabbed the cross off the wall, ran back down. Father Okafor took it from me and placed it in the center of the salt circle. Then he resumed his prayers. The change was immediate. The cross started to glow, not with visible light, with something deeper. The figures around me reacted. They moved closer to the cross, reaching for it. Their forms started to solidify, become more real, more human. The pull reversed. Instead of pulling me toward the threshold, I felt the threshold itself contracting, closing. The doorway Calloway had opened was sealing shut. The patients were being released. I could see it happening. Their faces changed. The agony faded. They looked peaceful. One by one, they faded from view, not pulled back into the threshold, just gone, released, free. Father Okafor's prayers reached a crescendo. The basement shook. I heard something crack, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The doorway was closing. The threshold was collapsing. I felt a wave of heat, then cold, then nothing. Silence. The candles went out. Father Okafor stopped praying. We stood in darkness for a long moment. Then he lit a flashlight. The basement looked normal, just concrete and pipes and old storage. The oppressive feeling was gone. The weight that had hung over this building for decades had lifted. Father Okafor blessed himself and said it was done. The threshold was closed. The patients were at rest. The building was clean. We went upstairs and found Zoe waiting in 8C. She saw our faces and started crying. I held her and told her it was over. We stayed in the building that night, and for the first time since moving in, I slept without nightmares. The next morning, I contacted police and showed them Gerald's files, showed them Father Okafor's documentation of the ritual, showed them the pattern of deaths and the connection to Riverside Hospital. This time with Gerald's letter already on record and Father Okafor's credibility as a priest backing the claims. They listened. They opened investigations into the deaths, contacted families, started the process of exhuming bodies for new autopsies. Dr. Calloway was arrested for his crimes at Riverside. At 93, he was too old for prison, but his medical license was revoked. His legacy was destroyed. The building was sold to a non-profit that converted it into housing for formerly homeless families. Zoe and I stayed in 8C for another year, watching new tenants move in, waiting to see if any more deaths occurred. None did. The threshold stayed closed. The building became normal, just an apartment building where people lived ordinary lives. No more deaths, no more suffering. We moved out eventually, graduated, started our careers, but I still drive by sometimes. Look up at the third floor where 8C sits. Remember the night I stood in the basement while 37 ghosts surrounded me. Remember choosing to help instead of hide. It could have killed me. Probably should have. But it didn't. Sometimes compassion survives. Sometimes caring matters more than safety. Sometimes the only way out is through. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.